Right, so in the past video, I talked about the notions of compulsory heterosexuality and compulsory able-bodiedness in relation to one another and how they reinforce one another. So in this video, I'm discussing queer disabled existence and what it means to exist in that way and different alternatives. So the author discusses how what's in terms of their relationship to one another of queer existence and disabled existence, the most successful heterosexual subject is one whose sexuality is not viewed as being tainted by disability or queerness, and the most successful able-bodied subject, their identity is not viewed as being tainted by queerness or disability, right? So being anything that's not heterosexual is viewed as some sort of disability. It's been pathologized. It was viewed as a mental disorder. And then not being able-bodied, right, is viewed as some sort of deviation from the norm, something that's not viewed as the ideal way of existing, right? It's viewed as a queer, different, weird way of existing. And I'm saying all this in quotes. So people with disabilities have been understood as queer, while people who are LGBTQIA plus individuals are understood as somehow disabled, right? So that's kind of how these systems are embedded within one another. However, queerness and disability can disrupt performances of able-bodied heterosexuality. So it doesn't have to always be that way. So how can we change things? Well, the author says that ability trouble and gender trouble are not sufficient in and of themselves to dismantle the systems of compulsory heterosexuality, able-bodiedness. We have to understand it in terms of being kind of critical about these systems in our society. And this is where the author distinguishes between a virtual identity, a critical identity, and a severe identity. So a virtually queer identity is basically anyone who fails to perform heterosexuality. So basically everyone, right? Not being able to be perfectly feminine or masculine and embody those roles in our relationships. Versus someone who is critically queer, or a critical queer identity is someone who is intentionally immobilizing this failure to embody the norm and using it as an opportunity to dismantle these oppressive systems of heterosexuality and able-bodiedness. And so the author says that we can map this on virtually queer identity and critically queer identity to disability. And so if one is virtually disabled, it's basically the failure to embody able-bodiedness fully, which is something that we're all inevitably going to experience as we age. And then someone who is critically disabled in a way that's similar to being critically queer, right? They are, it's how the disability rights movement and disability studies have resisted compulsory able-bodiedness and tried to create a public sphere that is not all about being able-bodied and obsessed with being able-bodiedness, right? It's not hinging upon that. Whereas the severely disabled, that definition is, and that identity and that way of existing is basically kind of turning our assumptions upside down. And it's not thinking about being severely disabled as the most disabled or the least privileged or the most marginalized, right? It's really thinking about it in terms of critiquing the failures of compulsory heterosexuality and using that epistemic perspective that comes with being disabled in some way, right, to really critique the failures of compulsory able-bodiedness, right? If you are able-bodied, it's really hard for you to critique it because you're living in that life, you're living that privilege, whereas if you aren't experiencing that, you're going to be able to critique it a lot more because you're not kind of blinded by that privilege. And so if someone is this idea of being severely disabled or critically queer, right? These bodies have resisted and reimagining can reshape the future and public sphere of our society. So the general kind of concept here then is that compulsory heterosexuality and compulsory able-bodiedness both work to reproduce the able body and the heterosexual body. They're intertwined systems in our society, but the dominance that able-bodiedness and compulsory heterosexuality have in our society are in danger of being disrupted and dismantled. So critical queerness and severe disability are about kind of transforming these systems in our society and reimagining bodies and desire outside of these compulsory systems that are viewed as ideal but really hard to live up to. So that's basically the author's thesis and argument in this essay.